thanks to the European Institute for the Mediterranean for hosting this seminar this afternoon. And I would like to thank you all for being here. And of course, I would like to thank John Dalhuisen for having accepted our invitation to participate in this talk this afternoon. So today we will discuss the topic of hate speech. And just to give you a general idea of the things that we will cover this afternoon, let me refer to a situation that happened not that long ago. Beatrice von Storr, she's a politician from the Alternative for Germany. It is a right-wing political party in Germany. About 2 years ago, wrote in her Twitter account something that says, she said, "What the hell is wrong with this country?" She was referring to Germany. And what motivated her, this statement from her, was that the national police in Germany had also published in the New Year's greeting message, they had included a message in Arabic language. And so she complained and she said, "This is just to appease barbaric Muslim rapist horde of men." So, of course, this all happened in the context of the German policy of taking in some refugees, and was criticized by some parties there. But some said this is clearly hate speech. But for her, that was just an exercise of her right of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression, as you know, it is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to express their opinions, their thoughts. They have the right to do so without intervention of all kinds, and they have the right to seek, receive, and impart thoughts in any media, regardless of their frontiers. Of course, for others, this was clearly an act of violation of human rights. And the thing is that the right of freedom of expression is not an unqualified right. It is also included in the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, where it is clearly stated that this, the exercise of the right of freedom of expression has certain limits. And the exercise of this right entails some duties and also some responsibilities, and that no one should exercise their freedom of expression to affect the rights of others or the reputation of others. The same other limitations are also included in the European Convention on Human Rights. Among other things, states are entitled to limit the right of freedom of expression whenever an action can lead or disturb national peace. Even though the hate speech is nothing new, we all know our European history, what happened in the Second World War. It was a systematic campaign against the youths. However, in recent years, this topic has been gaining attention as a result of immigration flows. This led the European Commission Against Racism and Toleration to issue a general policy recommendation in which they approach hate speech as the unjustified idea that some people is better than others, and that this sometimes leads to acts of violence and discrimination. Therefore, they call for some actions of European states. They call politicians to take speedy actions against hate speech. They also call the media to exercise self-restraint. They also ask that in some extreme circumstances, this hate speech should be subject to criminal sanctions. But they also caution that they shouldn't limit the freedom of expression to the point that this could prevent criticism against political parties, and they could abuse this. In the situation that took place in Germany, for instance, when Beatrice von issued this statement, in Germany, incitement to hatred can lead to criminal penalties of up to 5 years. And the Federation of Newspapers in Germany complained because they said that they were deleting some of the messages that they were thinking about printing, but they, out of fear of facing criminal sanctions, they had to stop. And the government promised to review the law, but it hasn't happened to my knowledge. So these are some of the things, the elements that come into play when we discuss hate speech. So with no further delay, I will leave you with John Dalhuisen so he can cover these topics. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you all for coming along, and my apologies in advance to those who've heard about half of what I have to say already this morning. If you ever came to listen to me a third time, that would be it, because there are only so many things that I think and know about. Miguel, I admit to being a little bit daunted initially when you said, well, hate speech and human rights. Can you talk about hate speech and human rights? I went, oh my God, this is a vast topic. And besides, I don't really know, what am I supposed to talk about? Am I supposed to talk about really kind of narrow hate speech and discussions around the permissible limits of the criminal prohibition of hate speech, freedom of expression? That's quite a narrow topic, or much more broadly about hate speech, its proliferation in political public discourse, and the impact this is having on human rights norms. And then I thought, God, now is quite a long time, so why don't I try and do both of these things? And I may live to regret it. And I may talk too little about hate speech and too much about the other things. But anyway, let's go for it. I think it makes sense to talk about both because they're clearly linked. And one of the things that links these two things, I think the central thing that links them, the proliferation of hate speech in the ordinary sense, the rise of populist parties, and where on earth and what on earth we should be prohibiting, what speech we should be prohibiting, is that the human rights requirements and accepted social norms around hate speech, xenophobia, migration control are increasingly contested across the political and ideological spectrum. So I think we live in a unfortunately, in a stage of extreme normative fluidity, flux, uncertainty. Like we used to feel that the role of human rights, the rules of the democratic game were clear. Okay, you had human rights, these prohibited discrimination but permitted a wide range of offensive speech, and a small group, easily categorized as racist, questioned this orthodoxy, and we called them the far right. And everyone in the middle, both ends of a political spectrum, left, right, conservative, liberal, could basically agree on this and what was outside the rules of the democratic game. And I think that what's happened is the rise of national politics national populism has utterly disrupted this paradigm. And it's exposed these kind of deep divides and considerable confusion about our normative frameworks. Let's just start with two basic and obvious statements. Hate speech, in the ordinary sense of offensive, hate-fueled speech based on various prohibited identity grounds, is rising, is proliferating, and especially online. And two, okay, so far-right parties are gaining in popularity. These phenomena present a risk both to the right specifically of minorities, migrants, and foreigners, but also, and I think significantly more broadly, to the integrity of a human rights framework, because these populist parties want to undo much more than just those rights that affect foreigners, minorities, refugees, migrants, but dismantle whole parts of a human rights infrastructure, whether that's gender equality, whether that's the freedom of media, whether that's the independence of the judiciary. You can see them, whether that's prohibitions on torture. They roll back on all these things. So while national populism and its rise is a big threat for human rights, how you respond to this phenomenon raises a whole load of questions about human rights. And so in the next hour or so, I'll try and explain why I think these things are happening and what can be done about them. And just to give you a kind of quick sense of my main argument, basically, concerns over migration and cultural identity are the key drivers, the single biggest driver of this rise of national populism. Some of these concerns and the ways in which they find expression are legitimate and need to be addressed. Some of these concerns and the ways they find expression are not and need to be countered. So reducing the appeal, combating the growth of national populism requires reducing irregular migration, just acknowledge it, accept it, and tackling hate speech, especially online. These can and indeed must be done in conformity with human rights. But mainstream parties are failing to do either of these things because of a lack of normative clarity. That both relates to the social acceptability and the human rights requirements around these phenomena. And I think more pointedly, the left, the right, the liberal, the conservative struggle to differentiate between the expression of legitimate grievances over migration and identity and what is, properly speaking, xenophobic. Crudely simplified, to make it really simple, conservatives are slow to condemn the xenophobic, and liberals are slow to acknowledge the legitimate. Yeah? Good. I think there's also profound confusion about human rights norms. So for all, that liberals and conservatives disagree increasingly strongly on their attitudes to migration, the social acceptability of expressing misgivings about migration, they share the same mistaken belief that human rights prohibit more than they actually do. So both think or speak in ways, imagine that human rights are more prohibitive than they actually are. So on migration, and this is a deep paradox, conservatives and liberals both incline to the view that you can't control borders because of human rights requirements. So conservatives frame this as rights inhibit them, prevent them from doing what they want to do. And the left sees it as prohibiting things that they don't want to do. So one side rails against rights. The right says, right, stop me doing this. And the other side says, we can't do this because of human rights. So the right thinks that, well, I got to do things that I'm not allowed to do in order to control migration. And the left thinks, or declines to do, things that it could do under the human rights framework. Because it thinks it can't or shouldn't, and then it can avoid having to do these things. On hate speech, perhaps the picture is more nuanced. And there's this wide agreement that, across a mainstream, we've got to do something. A lot of people talk about this, and how can we tackle this? We've got to tackle it. But then the range of views on this are multitudinous and hotly contested, including within the rights community itself. How much weight do we give to the freedom of expression? And human rights advocates sit there agonizing about this. And then on the far right end of the spectrum, you have increasing people contesting these norms who feel that they can't say what they want, rail against the politically correct, rail against what they present human rights as prohibiting them from saying, when in fact they can pretty well say whatever they want, and in most jurisdictions. So again, the perception and the reality of what rights prohibit and require are out of sync with each other. And so I suppose my main argument is that the human rights framework is actually currently more or less in the right place. We're just going about things in the wrong way. They allow for effective, humane border control and measures to tackle online hate speech in conformity with the freedom of expression. It's just that we're not doing them because we're confused. And I'll try and explain a little bit what I think some of those policies might look like. But I'm going to go back a bit to kind of challenge certain assumptions on the rest, to the original question. Like, why is this actually happening? What's fueling the rise of these far-right populist parties? And I'm going to kind of give you some demo slides. But I think the first thing to note is an apparent conundrum. There's a seeming paradox here, is that while hate speech is proliferating online, populist parties are on the rise, overtly racist, xenophobic attitudes and discriminatory acts are decreasing. And they're decreasing consistently across European societies. So you've got more people voting for far-right parties, or parties we categorize as far-right, and less societal racism and less instances of discrimination. So what's going on? What's going on? First, a little bit on hate speech. It's quite hard to track. Hate speech data is quite sparse. There isn't a lot of it, and there isn't a lot of it online. But people are beginning to try and measure this. Germany has been one of the first. It's not this statistic, it's another. It recorded a 176% increase in what it describes as hate speech. This is the German Interior Ministry, between 2014. And a slower but ongoing rise ever since. Right? So from 2015, 14, 15, it starts shooting up massively and still rises. And this is consistent with the trend in this graph. This is for the Volksverhetzung. That's the German offense for incitement to racial, ethnic, or religious hatred. And you see again a pretty dramatic spike from 2015, 16, 17. So you see definitely, whatever else is happening in society, the propensity of people who hold extreme or prejudiced views to express them and to act on them has gone up. What do we mean by act on them? Act on them also in the sense of hate crime. So hate crime has also spiked, and it's spiked significantly. And again, from about the same time, 2014, 15. So this is Germany, official recorded instance of hate crime. You see the rise. And it's pretty well the same everywhere else. This is the UK, 2011 to 2017, 18. Again, you see it suddenly starts clocking up, and more or less about the same time as in Germany. Partly this is slightly misleading because the British police got a little bit better and started caring more about recording hate crime. You'll see the bizarre fact, the British record 100,000 incidents of hate crime, and the French 1,000. It's not because the British are 100 times more likely to commit hate crimes than the French or the Italians or indeed the Spanish. But the broad point, you get the picture. It starts increasing very significantly around the same time and pretty consistently across European countries. Then you get, okay, this is just to break it down a little bit more, just to give you a sense of the correlation between things happening in the real world and recorded incidents of hate crime. This is the UK example. You get a similar example in a graph in other countries. These spikes relate to phenomena in pretty obvious ways. Embarrassingly, a surge in hate crime after the Brexit vote, surges again in relation to specific terrorist attacks. I mean, none of that should be particularly surprising to anyone. It's pretty self-explanatory. Then again, just to take through a little bit the rise of the far right, of national populists, in case anyone's under any misgivings about how significant this phenomenon is. Start spiking significantly. This is France, again, 2012, 13, 14, 15, suddenly through the roof. And like, if you want the very latest, that's the presidential election, Macron, Le Pen, neck and neck. And this is the European parliamentary elections. The leading party in France is the once Front National, now the Rassemblement National. AfD, what didn't even exist in 2012, it's up and up and up and up and up, and still at 14% today. This one's perhaps the most dramatic of all, La Lega, from 6% the European elections 2014 to the latest opinion polls, 33% by some margin, the most popular political party in Italy. But then we start looking at some of the indicators of racism and prejudice. And it starts getting a bit less clear, because clearly societies have, on average, got less racist. You all know this anecdotally. I don't know, or maybe not that many of you were going to football matches 20 years ago, but you know, it was ubiquitous to hear racist chanting everywhere, every single stadium. And today, well, not so much. This is, well, reflected in, okay, it doesn't look very significant, and indeed it's not as significant as evolutions in other attitudes. But on average, self-perception of racism edges down. It rises and it comes down. But if you go from 1983 to 2013, there's a gradual descent. What there certainly is not is an increase in a self-reporting, a self-description of racism. You know, this is a classic indicator of conventional racism, a very good one. Would you want to mind someone in your family marrying a person of different ethnic origin? In this case, it's the UK, it's West Indian and Asian, and the trend is conspicuously downward. You see the same kind of trend in relation to other indicators. Like, do you think that other races are inferior to yours? You get the same trend, and you get it in lots of different countries, but I haven't put it up because you start getting bored. What has happened, however, is that the evolution of social norms is much slower on race and ethnicity than it has been on gender equality, than it has been on sexuality. So here you see a much more rapid increase in tolerance of this phenomenon. But one thing is significantly off the statistical average, and that's the relation to Muslims. So here you see the proportion of people who would mind a member of their family marrying a Muslim is way higher than for any other ethnicity. And again, this is pretty consistent across countries. So this is a kind of, so let's call it a racist outlier. Much worse, much more anxiety about Muslim communities than any other. And I think this is hugely significant. Not least, okay, it's hard to measure because people are weighing both ethnic factors and religious factors. This adds to the level of complication in how you judge this score. Is it xenophobic? Well, what's the legitimate part of that score? Is it legitimate to have concerns on the basis of religious antipathy or not? Again, I don't think we have a clear normative framework on that, and a clear sense of what is and what is not acceptable. Then kind of acts of discrimination. This is what I think most people find the most surprising. Okay, well, this is still on the Islam stuff. I mean, I think these numbers are shockingly high. Okay, the question is Islam fundamentally incompatible with a country's culture and values? Yes is on the left, no is on the right. Okay, consistently this is above 30%. In some places it's closer to 50, and everywhere it's around 40. That's 40% of a population that think of a growing part of its population as having values that are fundamentally incompatible with it. Okay, that if anything, is a feeding ground for populists. It's this. These numbers should make people immensely worried. Because that is very high numbers in respect of a really significant judgment. Because the judgment is essentially, are they fit to be members of our society? That's what the question is asking. And that's the answer you get. Then, on actual instances of discrimination. So this is perceived discrimination, the percentage from these groups who felt discriminated against in the last 12 months. These are EU statistics from 2019, 2017. And they've gone down. They've gone down for every group. They've even gone down for North Africans who are Muslim for the overwhelming part. So that's an insight into that. It's gone down. I mean, I'd say that was quite a significant decrease over 10 years. So, how to make sense of this? What's going on? You've got, on average, people who've got more tolerant, less likely to discriminate. But you've got a minority of racists who are more likely to commit offenses and engage in hate speech, certainly since 2014-15. But has this population, this minority of overtly racist people, grown? Right? So who's voting for far-right parties that wasn't voting for them 10 years ago? Who are they? What are they like? What do they think? So one explanation is that this minority has increased. You've got a more vocal, more assertive, and growing minority of highly xenophobic people that is offset in terms of a national racist average by an increasingly tolerant and unracist majority. So you've got a flight from the middle. It's just more people have gone to being more tolerant, but some have shifted to being less tolerant, and that accounts for the, on average, 10% rise, 7-8% depending on the country, increase in popularity of populist parties. That's one version of it. The other explanation is that the support for national populists includes people who are, in fact, only moderately racist, or do not even perceive themselves as being racist in the classical sense at all. Racist in the classical sense of believing in doctrines of racial superiority. And a lot of people who don't believe that are still voting for far-right parties. And this group would include people who are worried about their communities, their identity, the erosion of values, and very significantly the erosion of these that's been prompted by the rise in migration from 2014. And they particularly worry about Islam, as you saw earlier. And for these, they feel that these concerns they have just been ignored by a political establishment for years. And they quite like the straight talking of a populist. The populists whisper things that they feel, that they agree with in some way, and don't necessarily perceive of as being racist. But do we call it racist? Is it actually racist? I don't know. But I think one thing is for clear, that there's no coincidence that the rise of national populism coincided with the spike in irregular migration. Right? That much is totally obvious. You can see from 2015 onwards, consistently, every single 6 months from that time, the top two concerns, and for the most part, the top one being migration, the second, terrorism. And by some margin, by a long way. So worries about the economy, climate change, everything else that we like to think that people worry about, actually people worry about them a whole lot less than these two things. They're the things that people care and stress about. But let's unpack it a little bit more. That's just to show the rise in terrorist incidents from around the same time, 2014, something goes ching, ching, ching. Attitudes to migration. I mean, oddly, in some respects, they haven't shifted that much. But the thing you'll see that's significant is the number that have gone from allow a few to allow none. Right? So that's like a hardening of attitudes. Again, so you see a small polarization. Some people have got more tolerant, allow many to come and live here. But a lot more people have got intolerant. A lot less people have got moderately intolerant, and well, about the same amount of people have remained moderately tolerant. So 2002, 2016, it's a similar set of indicators with a similar trend, allow many few immigrants of different race, ethnic group, similar question, different outcome. And here you get the kind of status, current status from, this is from 2017, a Pew survey report on the percentage who say the number of immigrants to their country nowadays should be increased or remain the same. Okay, two things are quite interesting. A majority still favors relatively high levels of immigration as we have known them. So that's the plus side. On the other side is that the number that think they should be reduced is very significant. If you combine the number that think they should be reduced with the intensity with which they feel it, that's recorded in the Eurobarometer data, you can begin to understand why national populists are doing pretty well. Of course, I suspect actually what's happening is that both these things are happening. You've got a shift of a certain growing minority of people we would ordinarily describe as racist, and a move to supporting far-right parties of people who wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as racist, would be hard perhaps even to characterize as racist, but feel that they have a whole series of legitimate grievances about migration that everyone else is ignoring. And the main point is that so the potential pool of far-right populist supporters is not limited to the already prejudiced. It includes the potentially prejudiced and people who don't think of themselves as racist at all. So dismissing those sympathetic to these messages straightforwardly as racist or uneducated is basically it's unhelpful and it's unwise and it's probably incorrect. But I think the thing to bear in mind is not to I don't want to minimize this problem in any way. It's to recognize that the potential for this community to grow even more is very great. And the potential for that constituency to accept progressively over time more and more restrictive and invasive violations of human rights is very large indeed. And if anyone needs a cautionary tale on this, the rise of National Socialism in Germany came 60 years after the emancipation of the Jews in Germany. 60 years later. 60 years of relatively successful integration of Jews into the political, social, and economic life of Germany. Of course, there are lots of other reasons driving this phenomenon. There are economic anxieties, there's anti-establishment feeling, distrust. It's part of the same phenomenon that sees people questioning vaccines, denying climate change, worrying about the erosion of socially conservative values, gay marriage, trans rights, abortion, gender rights, all these things that large proportion of the population feels uncomfortable about. But it's clearly not just these things, and I think it's pretty unambiguously, very significantly driven by concerns over migration. And tackling this most proximate cause is I think, key. But what you've certainly got from all these factors is a susceptibility of a large chunk of your population to two key populist stories, in respect of which a mainstream doesn't have counter stories. And they're a story on migration and they're a story on rights. And stories are very important, because actually stories are what make people vote the way they do and think the way they do. And the populist story, I can't look at you guys because I already rabbited on about this all day, so I have to look over here. On migration is a very simple one. It's a very compelling one. And it's Europe faces a barbarian invasion that is eroding our culture, will sweep us away, and a mainstream establishment either is complicit in this, thinks it's a good thing, or lacks the will to resist it. The only people that will protect you, your identity, your culture, Christian Europe, is me. Me, because I have a tolerance for the cruelty that is necessary to stop migration and close borders. let me take you through some of these, just to back up my claim that this is the fundamental story. This is the fundamental architect of the story, the key driver of this narrative. If things continue like this, our culture, our identity, and our nations as we know them will cease to exist. Our worst nightmares will have become reality. Day by day, their cultural foundations are being transformed. The population raised in a Christian culture is declining, and the major cities are undergoing Islamization. There you go. And then you've got other people are failing. So the gravity of the situation of European civilization has been revealed by the migrant crisis. Let me take a complex thought and simplify it. He's a genius, this guy. We must face up to the fact that Europe's leaders are inadequate, and they've been unable to defend Europe against immigration. The European elite has failed, and the European Commission is the symbol of that failure. So what's needed? I cannot see the political forces with the will and the ability to stop these processes, let alone, horribile dictu, reverse them. I mean, it's quite a hardcore thing to say, reverse. Because what does reverse mean? What's migration less than zero? Migration less than zero is expulsion. It's quite hardcore. And he says, I can do it. Because I have the will. All that is required is will. That. That's it. That is the populist narrative in a nutshell. Invasion, but we have the will to stop it. Then there's a second narrative. This is the story about rights that they tell. So we used to have a story, and I think it was a reasonably well accepted part of the social contract, that rights were things that protected individuals from the tyranny of tyrants or indeed majorities. It protected your freedom and your dignity, and people imposed them on governments. The story the populist tells is that rights are restrictions that governments, establishments, liberal elites impose on citizens that stop them saying what they want, doing what they want, to protect the things that they care about. Whether that's cultural values, whether that's their identity, whether indeed that's their economic security. So let me take you through a quote here. The trap is the claim that Christian democracy can also, in fact, be liberal. Let us confidently declare that Christian democracy is not liberal. Here, when it comes to the relationship between two human beings, a fundamental view of the liberal way of organizing a society holds that we are free to do anything that does not violate another person's freedom. Fine. This idea is very attractive on an intellectual level, yet it is not clear who is going to say at what point my freedom is violated. And as this does not come without understanding, then it has to be fixed and determined by someone. And as nobody was appointed to decide this, therefore everyday life experience suggested to us that it was the stronger party who decided this. We constantly felt that the weaker was stepped on. This is the Prime Minister of Hungary. This is the leading intellectual luminary of the European populist movement. We constantly felt that the weaker was stepped on. This is the 2019 story of rights. This is what a mainstream establishment should be worried about. This is what you should be worried about. Because how do you counter that story? Not by doing what a European mainstream political establishment and the rights community indeed is doing at the moment. Okay, so let's kind of pause. You've got these two phenomena, a rise in hate speech and hate crime, and a growing propensity of prejudiced people to act on their prejudice. And you've got, I think, a growing anxiety of those who are not overtly racist, but are anxious about identity, migration, and security, and feel these concerns have been ignored for too long by an establishment. So I think you've got to tackle both these things. You've got to tackle the rise in hate speech, and you've got to address the underlying driver of a rise in support for populist parties, and that is tackling irregular migration. But it's not just what you do, it's how you do it. You must challenge the story. And part of challenging the story is how you implement your counter-narrative. So look, quickly on migration, and then I'll spend some time discussing how this might play out in respect of hate speech. Irregular migration, okay, let's accept it. It has to be controlled. This is both a legitimate demand, even if you disagree with it, which is also a legitimate thing to do. You can be open borders if you want, but it's not going to help you very much because no one with an open border agenda will ever be elected to office, right? So that one's just out. Accept it. Idealists among us accept this. Indeed, mainstream leaders have, by and large, accepted this. The right more enthusiastically, the left more reluctantly, but both have bent to this reality and sought to reduce irregular migration. Sadly, they have completely failed to do this in a way that will, in fact, stop the rise of populists. Because they've failed to tell a different story on migration, what's actually happening, and because they've failed to implement measures that are demonstrably different to what populists say are the solutions to controlling migration, i.e. cruelty. So they have reinforcing no counter story and the same set of policies. And this is not a good plan. It seems that the basic hope has been we will bring down the numbers anyhow, doesn't really matter how, even if that's basically backing Salvini, getting rid of boats, even if that's basically accepting that we need to have shitty deals with Libya and they'll keep everyone there. Doesn't matter how we do it, so long as we get the numbers down. So indeed they have got the numbers down. The reality is numbers are down to 100,000 a year last year. That's about the same as the before 2014 average. But mainstream parties hoping that this will be enough are, I think, sorely mistaken. Because what they don't get is that the populist narrative is number-proof. It's number-proof. It's totally resistant to the actual reality of the amount of numbers for two reasons. One, the populist claims the success. Because only they can stand up and say, yep, we said we needed to be cruel. Look, we've been cruel. Hey, it's worked. So they win in terms of having had the policies that actually do the job. Their policies are perceived as having done the job. And then they get to say, well, my numbers might be down, but they'll go up again tomorrow if you get rid of me. Because I'm the one who's doing this, not Merkel, not Macron, certainly not Sanchez. And this is, well, it's a problem. So you need to tell a different story. What is your story? Europe doesn't face an invasion at all. It's just not true. It's not numerically true, and it won't be true. The numbers predicted migration catastrophizing is deeply counterproductive and false. But liberals like to say it too. Mainstreams also like to say, the numbers are coming are massive. Climate change is going to change everything. Millions of people are coming. But when the people voting for far-right parties hear millions of people are coming, they don't think, oh, great, we need to do development in Africa. Oh, great, we need to tackle climate change. They think, shit! Build a wall for me, please. That's what they hear. Every time they hear millions of people are coming. That's what they hear and that's what they think. So don't tell that story, not least because it's not actually true. And implement migration control policies that are demonstrably different, i.e. actually respect rights norms, to those that populists are advocating. And the problem with this is that these kind of exist, these policies. I'll try and talk you through a version of them. But they're resisted, again, partly because the right thinks, well, it can get away with systematically rights-violating policies so that keep everyone out. So why should I risk a more welcoming, tolerant policy? And they're resisted by the left because they involve elements that they don't like and that they then describe as not being human rights compliant. But essentially what they don't like, what liberals don't like, is the idea of returning people. That's what liberals don't like. But there is no way of controlling migration without accepting the fact that you need to be able to return people who do not have a claim. And that requires you to accept the need to make a distinction between those who are refugees and those who are not. And at a moral level, this starts getting a little bit difficult for some people, kind of rightly. Because the guy fleeing persecution, the lady fleeing poverty. From their perspective, massive difference? Not so sure. But you need a cap somewhere, because no society tolerates everyone. Societal empathy is finite. So you've got a situation where you need to be able to transform your migration control system, your asylum system, so that you can actually meaningfully return people. Because the alternative form of control that we have now is stop them in places where they'll be woefully abused, or just don't bother to rescue them at all. So if you want people to have access, if you want people not to be treated appallingly in transit countries, you have to accept that you need to change your asylum system. And in what ways do you need to change it? You'd need to have much quicker asylum determination proceedings, much quicker than now. Not months or years, but 6 weeks, 2 months. What does that require? It requires not having endless amounts of appeals. One. Again, as people start getting nervous about this. But this isn't fair. Can you do it properly? And you get a whole bunch of liberals and rights advocates saying, well, we can't do this because it violates human rights. But it's not true. It could if it's done very badly, but that's about will. Probably it also requires an element of detention. Again, there are pretty good reasons to be squeamish about this, to be nervous about, do I want to really detain arriving migrants? It's not very nice. Yeah, it's not very nice. But it is rights compliant. Right? Not for everyone. Certainly not. There'd be categories for whom it would be woefully inappropriate. You know, torture survivors, children, a whole load of other categories as well. But for many, if it can be done in decent conditions, in 6 weeks, and you're either a recognized refugee and can get on for your life and be integrated somewhere, it's maybe not such a bad deal after all. But again, you get all the liberals say, no, we can't do it, we can't do it, we can't do it. And then they say that human rights norms prohibit it. But it's not true. And lastly, you need to be able to return people. And return is fiendishly difficult. It's fiendishly difficult. But then you have a whole load of European governments talking about all the wrong things, or being fundamentally duplicitous. So they try and negotiate return agreements with countries of origin that it would enable them to return all irregular migrants. But they can't return all irregular migrants, ever. There are far too many of them. It's far too difficult. It's far too expensive. Actual numbers of return are pathetic, minuscule, like 2%, 3%, 4%. And conversely, for the country of origin, they're never going to accept this at all. They can't sell that back to their Ghana, saying back to its people, sorry, but now you can all come home now. We're going to cooperate with this. It's an unsellable proposition. So what you need is return realism, which involves an element of moral realism as well. Like, okay, you accept the need that some people have to be returned, but just who are the people that I would have to return that's morally justifiable and would make a difference to the numbers of people setting out? You want to return the people immediately after they've arrived so you can close a route by discouraging people from setting out who don't have a claim in the first place. And that is perhaps a negotiable deal with countries of origin. So you are only agreeing return deals for those who arrive on specific routes from a specific date. Call it day X return deals. That's a negotiable proposition. But it's a transaction. You also have to offer them stuff. All of this requires only a coalition of willing states, some to set up the centers and to negotiate the agreement, others to help negotiating these agreements, and to accept the relocation of refugees from these centers. Relocate refugees, not asylum seekers. The idea that Europe invests all this time in Dublin reform so we can relocate asylum seekers and then it will all be fine is to fantastically miss the point. Because making an unmanageable problem in a few places, Italy, Spain, France, manageable, but a little bit less unmanageable everywhere, doesn't solve the basic problem that is fueling the populist anxiety. And moreover, it's completely politically unsellable because Poland, Hungary, Italy, and a whole lot of others will resist it. So stop talking about EU reforms. The obsession of a political establishment, oh, there's a European problem, there must be an EU solution. It's untrue, it's unwise, and will never end up with an effective result. So there we go on migration. You need, in short, a different story, policies that match them, policies that are rights compliant, and you need a majority to have sufficient clarity about what is acceptable and what is not, what rights require and what they don't, to implement these things. But that level of clarity about what rights require, what's okay and what isn't, is conspicuously absent because of an increasingly conflicting ideological battles and normative confusion. Which brings me then to the hate speech component of this. And it's obvious that hate speech is a subject of intense contestation. And it's at the heart, indeed, of much that is driving the far right itself. And the far right has transformed itself over the last 5 years into the most ardent defenders of free speech. The freedom to say whatever they want. Oh, this was Wolf as well. Oh, I missed all that. Oh, but this is the link between the populist narrative, their objection to their sense that they can't say what they want, Eurobabble, liberal grandstand, and PC platitudes. That's how they qualify the modern view on all this. But then here you've got basically the different views on hate speech. You got from the right, hate speech is free speech. You try and kill for hate speech, you end up killing free speech. And you've got a fairly large proportion of the human rights community that would also basically agree with this. And then on the other side, you have a spectrum of people going, we condemn freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings. And this also has quite a large constituency within a liberal establishment. This is kind of the social justice warrior end of the liberal spectrum. He thinks, whoa, hold on. We've been way too tolerant of hate speech. Hate speech is deeply toxic, deeply harmful, and we should be able to restrict it much, much more invasively. Basically, no violence, no hate speech. Hate speech is violence, is another part of the narrative. And I say it now slightly dismissively. But these people are onto something. They're not wholly wrong about this. And the human rights orthodoxy that free speech should essentially prevail in the normative hierarchy over the restricting hate speech is, I think, questionable. And this is certainly a question that a society needs to constantly re-examine if that balance is right. But so the last attempt to formulate that balance happened in about 2013 and resulted in the Rabat principles on combating racism, respecting freedom of expression, something like that. The title was a giveaway, I've got it wrong. And it definitely kind of reconfirmed this orthodoxy. The idea that, well, you know, in the end, the right to freedom of expression is the most important element. It's better to err on the side of being permissive. You should tackle hate speech. Of course you should tackle hate speech, but don't do it through criminal prohibitions because these will tend to go too far. So do other things. The problem being no one really knows what these other things are supposed to be. You know, like encourage journalists to be responsible. Do awareness raising campaigns. I mean, it's all bollocks, basically. Because when push comes to shove, I mean, the stuff that matters is what you can do and what you can't do because you will be prosecuted. So those are some of the tensions there. But it seems to me that, again, well, you've got these different constituencies pulling rights in different directions. I think they probably are actually just about in the right place. And they would allow for much more criminalization of hate speech than is currently accepted or attempted. You just have to qualify much better what it is that you're trying to prosecute. And I'll come back to that in a second. But, I mean, in relation to the specific manifestations of hate crime as they occur in relation to populist movements, as they occur over the last few years, you know, a significant component of this is the online component. And so you have various governments, authorities, but we need to tackle this. And there are essentially the two ways of doing it. One is you try and regulate platforms. You know, what is the responsibility of Twitter, Facebook, all the rest of it? And again, more and more people talk about it. Only the Germans have actually done something about it. So the Germans imposed a law that said, well, you have to have coherent standards, transparent standards, a transparent complaint network, and you have to remove any illegal content within 24 hours. The problem being that these networks don't know what illegal content is, because illegal content is a blisteringly complex thing to determine, yet you have them liable to fines that can go up to 50 million euros. So Twitter is not highly incentivized to err on the side of freedom of expression. Twitter is incentivized to err on the side of restricting free speech. So this has made a whole load of rights organizations very uncomfortable with this kind of policing by proxy. You get the service provider to do what the state can't or doesn't want to do, it doesn't have the resources to do. And I think a lot of those objections are fundamentally correct. But it seems to me that the requirement that online platforms have, at the bare minimum, transparent standards, which can be wherever they want to put them. I mean, you can accept that your platform is going to be a place in which you tolerate a whole load of offensive stuff, or you can say that this is a platform in which we don't, but short of stuff that actually incites violence, discrimination, and hostility, they can put it where they want, so long as they're clear about it and they have a complaints mechanism. That, I think, is a reasonable proposition. But then the key element is essentially what a society communicates to its citizenry about what is permissible. And how it does that is through what it criminalizes. And we have an intense reluctance to criminalize clearly what hate speech is. Though lots of countries have all sorts of pieces of legislation that allow them to prosecute offensive material, blasphemy. Spain still have blasphemy. A number of countries still do have blasphemy laws. Grossly offensive communications, that's the British legal category. The problem is twofold. In one, online, there's so much of this stuff that prosecutors can't begin to trawl through it in a way that doesn't make them look very arbitrary. And secondly, frankly, determining what's offensive, which you're allowed to do, and what's grossly offensive that you're not allowed to do, is difficult. Your misjudgments fuel the far-right concerns about free speech, fuel their narrative that they're not allowed to say stuff anymore, and risk being very counterproductive. So I will end with one different way of looking at it, and then you can think about it. Almost all discussion about hate speech, and certainly discussion about how to criminalize it, focuses on individual speech acts. You talk about criminalizing speech, a phrase, words, said once. And I think this is the mistake. And I think it would be much more helpful, much more likely to generate a usefully and definably prosecutable category to focus on behavior. And see behavior as something that manifests itself through repeated speech acts. And then that would need to be behavior that is intended to be hurtful or denigrate or dehumanize. So there's a link to harm. You have to intend to harm, because hate speech harms. Social justice warriors are right about this. They are also right about the fact that a lot of this online diatribe is organized. This isn't spontaneous. This is people like setting out to do this and to normalize their discourse and to intimidate others. So it's organized and it's harmful, and you need to counter it. But can you do this by framing this as a behavior that manifests itself through repeated speech patterns? And I think, though I haven't thought it through to its bitter end, that this would be a much more helpful way of trying to define hate speech than by looking at isolated and individual expression. Not least because that isolated individual expression may be the result of being a little bit drunk. But if you're doing it again and again, you can demonstrate an intent to invasively denigrate and dehumanize, then you're prohibiting behavior, not speech, in a way that would be more consistent with the freedom of expression. So I'll leave it with that little reflection, a way to look at and think about criminalizing hate speech. But the bottom line is, unless we can work out and clearly define rules about what it is permissible to say and do in relation to these vexed issues of hate speech, migration control, we're in for a very rocky road for a very long time.
Thank you very much, John. I would like to correct an omission. I didn't present correctly John. He is now Senior Fellow of the European Stability Initiative, and he is the former Director of Amnesty International for Europe. So thank you very much, John, for your insights. We have structured this session today, 1 hour of a general overview of hate speech, which John just presented. And we would like to open the floor if there are some questions from the audience. Well, I'll begin.
Very good. Those guys are questioned out. They've had to hear this already.
Okay.
You lot have got to ask some questions. They've done their bit.
No. This is. I always like to have a general overview of things. Most of the time, we tend to study one specific event, and we focus on that event from a single perspective. And I would like to have your opinions on hate speech. Is clearly violence. It's clearly violence. And it's common knowledge that violence leads to violence. You gave us some information and statistics about the impact that hate speech have here in Europe. Well, you mentioned that 40% of the population in some countries feel that people living in their countries, their values are incompatible, which this is a thing to worry about. This is the thing that populist parties can exploit. And in fact, this hate speech is addressed to them. But that's one thing. Another thing is what happens with the groups that feel affected by the hate speech. And even though there are many groups that can feel affected by hate speech, in recent years, the Muslim world has been particularly affected by this. So on the other part of the world, there is also something going on which could be labeled as hate speech. And the effect that is happening could be, well, connected to terrorism, not only there, but also here in Europe. So I would like you to hear your comments about that particular thing, what is going on with the hate speech and the effect it produces in other countries, and how that affects us again here in Europe. So,
I think there are two questions. Like, what in relation to Islam is correctly qualified as hate speech? I don't think we've got our bearings, or we're not clear about it, or at least there are highly divergent views on what is.
Yeah.
The second question is, well, what is the impact of people saying offensive things on Islam on other parts of the world?
Yeah.
And one of the consequences seems to be pretty clearly is they in turn start saying a whole lot of really offensive things about the West, and indeed acting on it as well, right? I mean, there's a clear correlation there. I mean, it seems to me the day you stop saying offensive things because you worry someone might plant a bomb under your door is a bad day. I mean, that's not a good thing. But I mean, you can see it also in the moves made by the Organization of Islamic States. It also introduces initiatives. It has a kind of stake in global discussions about freedom of expression, and keen to very significantly increase, in respect of international norms, the protection that's given to religions. And ardent defenders of legislation they have back home are blasphemy laws, and increase the restrictions placed on insulting religious belief, which in a lot of jurisdictions in Europe is already prosecutable in one way or another, even in countries that have removed blasphemy laws. And I don't know, I gotta say, I don't personally have a lot of sympathy for this. It seems to me that you have to allow a very wide margin for people to be pretty rude about religious belief. And the idea that you are, by insulting the belief, insulting the individual, I think is a twist. I mean, Europe had a whole load of blasphemy laws that needed to be got rid of. They got rid of them, and I have little sympathy for those who suggest that other religions now, or Islam in particular, deserves any special carving out. Having said all that, on that side, I very much on the freedom of expression side. But I think it is also true that lots of liberal and particularly atheist people have very little understanding of just how significant religious belief is to people's identity. Like, this is a profound part of who a human being is. So I think it ends up being one of these slightly awkward categories where the harm and the offense is very high, not necessarily less high than racist, offensive racist speech, but the social reasons for being tolerant in respect of it are higher. Because after all, religions are, however attached people are to them, still fundamentally only ideas. And they can often be very bad ideas. And even if they're very good ideas, people should be able to disagree with very good ideas. So that's kind of what I think about.
Well, thank you very much. Is anyone on the floor that would like to ask a question? Please.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the speech. I wanted to ask you, well, I don't think that liberals don't give some solution for the problem of immigration in particular. And about that, I would like to know your opinion about like a European reform for an asylum system. Mm-hmm. And well, I know that in this moment is the national state that have to examine the demand of asylum. Wouldn't it be better to have like a common European system for asylum seekers? And then my second question was, what do you think about improved legal way to come to Europe, to enter to Europe? Wouldn't it be useful to avoid illegal migration? Because I don't think that this, like to stress the point, to stress the difference between refugees and not refugees, so who has the right to come here and who has not, I don't think that is quite useful for that people that want another life here. I've been working like with immigrants, and it's not so clear the border between refugees and not refugees. So yeah, don't you think that like also economic migrants have, isn't it a human right, like to have a better life or work or, and okay, and according to this, you said that we are not like, it's not an invasion of migrants. So why, I don't see the need to avoid people coming here. If it's true that they are useful for our economies, why we shouldn't accept them?
Look, so basically the reality is this. At lots of levels and at an intellectual level, you're perfectly right. It's just that lots of people disagree with you, and they disagree with you enough to vote for people who do horrible things and win elections. So that's the reality you face. And do you accept that reality? That's the kind of the moral and strategic dilemma that people like you and indeed people like me face. I mean, on European reform of the European asylum system. Yes. Yeah, you could have a more rational system which would ensure better distribution, easier management of asylum demands and destination for refugees in Europe if this was centralized. Yes. But it will never happen. Or not in a time frame that it's useful to talk about it, that is politically relevant. Because that requires colossal reform of EU. That's treaty revision. And no one is going to change the European treaties right now. So, okay, so you're right, but so what? Okay, maybe you don't want to hear it, but I mean, you're right, but so what? And I don't mean the so what flippantly, I mean that like really seriously. It's not helpful. So talking about solutions that cannot be politically implemented right now, that don't help someone who has to win an election and defeat these people, Going to them and saying, do this, reform the European asylum system, do that, and everything will be wonderful. Well, they go, well, okay, but what do I do with that? I can't do that. Like, it's not a platform. So it basically doesn't help. It's also not strictly speaking necessary, right? So everything that needs to happen can be done without it. So why talk about a policy proposal that is completely politically impossible as a solution to an urgent problem? So, okay, so liberals have solutions. This is their solution, but it's not a solution. It's the same with Dublin reform. Let's reform Dublin. Let's have mandatory relocation quotas. You need other states to agree with this. And they're not going to agree to it. So again, it's just not a helpful proposal. The EU is overwhelmed with irrelevant or unworkable proposals. So the EU like say, let's have 10,000 more. Some of the more irrelevant ones are the repressive ones. 10,000 more Frontex guards. For what? For what? Regional disembarkation platforms in other countries. Why are they even talking about this? Apart from the fact that they violate every single norm you can think of. But there aren't even countries who will receive them. You know, on all sides of the political spectrum, the amount of illusory or irrational, politically unworkable thinking is enormous. Then on legal migration, yes, your goal should be to substitute irregular for regular migration. But simply adding more legal migration channels to existing irregular migration channels doesn't help anything at all. And in that context is completely unsellable. You can't say, people are already worried about irregular migration. You come along and say, oh, well, let's have loads of regular channels. I mean, I used to say this the whole time at Amnesty International until I got sick of it. We need more safe and legal routes. Like, for a start, I couldn't even say what they were. Which safe and legal, I don't know. And then the idea that this was somehow going to stop irregular migration, because they're also totally different people. All right, so they're not the same. Because suddenly going, oh, I'm going irregularly. Oh no, there's a legal route now. There's a work visa. There's this and the other. It's not the same people who will go for it. But it seems to me that if you are trying to negotiate a return agreement, one of the things that you should be offering is regular migration in exchange. And I'm pretty sure that you should offer them in roughly the same proportion. 5,000 Ghanaians come irregularly every year to Europe. About 5,000, 4,000 in the last few years, before 2017. A tiny fraction of them got protection status, and an even smaller fraction were ever returned. And they swill about an irregular economy. I mean, they find economic activity because, as you say, people need them. Okay, but then it makes sense to say, well, look, you take back these 4,750 who don't get protection, and I give you 5,000 regular circular migration visas. That seems like a sensible transaction. That's then a meaningful swapping of irregular for regular. That makes lots of sense. And I think it's politically sellable to a public. But the sine qua non for more safe and legal routes is closing irregular ones or reducing them. Do you accept that?
I think that for the future it has sense. Thanks. Because, of course, the change of migrants, that we are talking about persons, we're not talking about staffs, you know. I mean, also your electoral speech, it doesn't justify that we are sending back people. I don't know. I think that electoral strategies cannot. they are not an argument for. I mean, I understand you.
How can they not be an argument? How can they not be an argument?
Because we are talking about people, like.
But precisely
know,
if you're talking about, so hold on, let me clear this. If you're talking about people, and you want the best for people, and the political system that you operate in is a democracy, and decisions get taken in the end by people who are elected, you should care profoundly about what is politically sellable. That's the thing you should care about most. Because if you want something to change, you need someone to be in power who will affect that change, and they need to win a vote.
Yeah, okay.
And only at the end of that do you get to actually helping someone.
Okay, but for the legal way to come here, no? I agree with the change of migrants, I was saying, but I think that for the future, to open our, to create legal way, it would avoid people to start illegal travel, dangerous travel, paying mafias to come to Europe, you know? I think for the future, it would be helpful because you will avoid other kind of migrations, allowing people to come here legally. Like for people that they are already here, of course, it's not a solution, but for the future, and also the Dublin reform, I don't think that during World War II, European Union was such a realistic idea, but they believed in that, and at the end they created it. I mean, the history, all the revolutions, all the change, were because people didn't agree with you, you know? Like, they agreed in utopias or something like that, or big ideals. Maybe it's just, I'm a student, so,
no,
I want to believe in these ideas because I think that...
And you should. And moreover, they're not bad ideas, right? I'm not saying these are bad ideas. I think these are good ideas intellectually, they're coherent, and these are good ideas morally, right? So good, so believe these ideas. These ideas are the right ideas, and that's very good, you should keep them, right? But the principal challenge at the moment for someone who cares about human rights is not how do I get the best possible migration system that I like the most. That's not your question. Your question is, how do I get a basically rights-compliant migration system? Because at the moment, you're way below that, way below. So people should stop, people who care should stop trying to bring it all the way up there. Like, be happy if you can get it to there. Because that would be, for the people that you care about, a significant improvement. And if you can make it get there by compromising a little bit on all the stuff up there, you are helping those people a lot. And therefore, it is the right moral calculation.
Well,
I'll work on you a little bit more afterwards. I see you're still resistant to idealistic pragmatism.
We still have time for one more question. Maybe we have time for one more question.
I have time for any more. I'll answer you outside if you want.
Hi, thank you for the conference. My question would be, we've seen a trend of populist nationalist parties to acknowledge, well, to criticize gender and sexual discrimination, and they've used it against Islam. Mm-hmm. In an hypothetical case where Islam was out of the picture, do you think this trend will stick? Or these parties could go back on, let's say, more abuse, not having these concepts?
I really think that the Islamic component is really central to much of this. That's kind of what tips many people over. I think there are a lot of people who aren't that racist but are very worried about Islam. And then you can debate whether that is in fact racist in one way or another. But I think that's the element that gives the story of barbarian invasion its potency. That's what gives the story power. Because it's the most visible change in communities. You see it. You see hijabs, you see minarets. and you witness, not literally for most people, thank God, but hear about terrorist attacks, right? So that's visceral. I think if you took it away, you would still have a backlash from some groups against liberal cultural values, social values. You definitely would. And that change has been very fast, and for some people, pretty uncomfortable. And there would be resistance to it. But I don't think that, I mean, that would just be a minority of people who grumbled about it. But I don't think it would have this explosive potential that that migration, Islam, visible community cultural change has. I mean, that's my suspect. I mean, what do you think?
I agree in a sense. I think it maybe other problems would appear, other clashes, but not this one. Like I think this mentality has slowly been accepted.
I mean, I just don't think it's a very good story, right? I mean, once you've got anxieties within that constituency who are worried about lots of other things, about cultural change and migration, Islam, it's easy to add a few more in. But on its own, I mean, it's not much of a political platform. Gender equality is bad. I mean, okay, yeah, some people think it, but yeah. Your community is radically changing in front of your eyes with people who don't like gender equality, don't like you wearing bikinis, who put bombs on buses. True, untrue, that's not what I'm talking about, but the story, that story clicks. I can see how that story can work, but the rest is not a, yeah, it appeals to some, but not.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to this conference. Thank you very much, John, for your insights. I'm just going to, the other day talking with this made me remind me of one of Freud's quote. He said, discrimination is basically based on fear. And the only way to overcome this fear or basic instincts is through education. Most of the reasons that feed this populist discourse, as we heard this afternoon, have no real base. However, we have 40% of the population in some developed countries in Europe that do believe that there is an attack to their values. So that is the challenge. And I believe that we all should take the responsibility because we live in a democracy. We vote for people. And we should exercise the control in the context of the democracy. And that being said, thank you very much. And, well, see you next time.